There is one thing that very few people know about themselves, and it's not something you find out at the doctor, or in a personality test, or in a conversation with a close friend. It's something God sees in you, silently, without judgment, without fanfare, every time you choose to forgive. Let me tell you a quick story. Imagine a man who spent 3 years building a business with a business partner. Sweat, sleepless nights, borrowed money, real risk. And on any Tuesday morning, he discovers that his partner embezzled money, signed contracts behind his back, and disappeared with half of what the two had built together. The lawyer said, "You have a solid case. Go to court." The family said, "This man deserves to suffer." Friends said, "Don't ever trust anyone again." And do you know what he did? He forgave. Not the next day, not easily, but he forgave. The people around were shocked. Some found weakness, others found it naive. Many simply did not understand. But the question that no one has asked, the question that really matters, is this: what was God seeing at that very moment? Because here's what most people have never stopped to think about. Forgiving isn't just an emotional reaction. It's not just a generous choice. Forgiving, according to the Bible and according to the psychology of the characters who lived within it, is one of the most spiritually meaningful human actions that exist. It's an act that reveals, with frightening clarity, who you are on the inside. And what does God see when you forgive? It will surprise you, not because it's beautiful, but because it's deep in a way that's going to change how you see yourself. The Bible is full of people who have forgiven the unforgivable. Joseph forgave the brothers who sold him into slavery. David forgave the king who tried to kill him several times. Jesus forgave in the most brutal moment of human history, nailed to a cross, looking into the eyes of the one who placed him there. And in each of these moments, there is a fascinating psychological pattern, a character trait that appears over and over again, and that modern science is only now beginning to understand, but that God recognized millennia ago. If you're the kind of person who forgives easily, this video is about you, about what's going on inside of you when you forgive, about what it says about your strength, not your weakness, about what God sees when others see naivety, and about why this ability that you carry can be one of the rarest and most sacred things that a human being can have. Stay until the end, because what comes in the next few minutes can completely change how you see yourself and how you see forgiveness. The secret your heart hides when you forgive. There is an exact moment when forgiveness really happens. It's not when you say the words. It's not when you send the message or make the phone call. It's not even when you stop talking about it. It's an internal moment, silent, almost imperceptible. It is the instant when something inside you, a tension, a resistance, a hardened pain, just loosens. And it is exactly at this moment that God sees something that most people around him will never notice. Let's talk about what your heart holds when you forgive, because it goes beyond what any Sunday sermon has ever told you. Modern psychology has a concept called emotional cognitive load. In simple terms, it's the mental weight you carry when you hold an active hurt. Every time you remember what happened, your nervous system activates a stress response. Your body releases cortisol. Your mind goes into a surveillance mode. You expend energy, real, physical, measurable energy, to sustain anger or resentment. Now think about the biblical characters who carried that weight. Think of Joseph. He was thrown into a cistern by his own brothers, then sold, then forgotten, then falsely accused. Years passed, years of slavery, of imprisonment, of silence. Any psychologist today would say that Joseph had more than enough reasons to develop severe post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anger, generalized distrust. But what the Bible reveals about Joseph's heart is surprising. At no point does the text describe him stoking hatred. At no time do we find Joseph rehearsing revenge or accumulating resentment. He feels it, he cries, he suffers, but it doesn't harden. And that, from a psychological point of view, is extraordinary. What Joseph kept in his heart was not naive innocence. It was something much more complex. It was the ability to process pain without letting it become identity. Psychologists call this advanced emotion regulation. Joseph felt the pain fully, but it did not become the pain. And God saw that. Now bring that into your life. When you forgive someone who has hurt you, whether it's a relative, an ex-partner, a colleague, a friend who cheated on you, what happens inside you in the process? There is a phase that few talk about, which is the mourning phase. Before you can truly forgive, you need to acknowledge what has been lost, the confidence that was there, security, the image you had of that person or that relationship. To forgive is not to pretend that nothing happened. To forgive is to acknowledge that something has been broken and to choose not to let those shards define you. The secret your heart holds when you forgive is this: you are exercising one of the highest forms of emotional autonomy that exists. You are saying, in silence, that the pain someone else has caused will not have permanent power over you, that you are greater than what they did to you. That's strength. It is not weakness. And God, who sees what is inside, not what is on the surface, recognizes this movement before anything else. In the Bible, the heart is always the moral center of the person, not the brain, not external actions, the heart. In Proverbs 4:23 it is written, "Above all that is to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it are the sources of life." The expression, sources of life, is not poetic for nothing. It points to the fact that what you cultivate internally is what will flow out, in your relationships, in your decisions, in your way of seeing the world. When you forgive, you're guarding your heart from something that could slowly poison you. Bitterness. Bitterness is interesting from a psychological point of view. It begins as a legitimate response to injustice. You've been hurt, you feel angry, and that anger makes sense. The problem is when anger does not find a way out and crystallizes. It becomes a lens. You begin to see everything through it. Distrust is widespread, the joy diminishes, creativity withers, the ability to connect with others is compromised. And all this without the person who hurt you having to do anything else. She has already left, but the bitterness that remained continues to work for her. When you forgive, you interrupt that process. And the deepest secret your heart holds right now is this: you're not doing it for the other person. You're doing it for you, and God knows that. God sees that you, even without fully understanding it, have chosen life, and not the golden prison of resentment. That's what's hidden in your heart when you forgive, and it is one of the most beautiful things that God contemplates in a human being. Why God doesn't see weakness. He sees what no one else can see. There is a phrase that many people grew up hearing, and that silently did a huge damage to how people see forgiveness. The phrase is simple: whoever forgives easily is a fool. You've heard some version of that. It may have come from a relative, a friend, a comment on a social network. And crude as it is, this idea penetrates deeply because it appeals to something that every human being has: the protective instinct. But there is an abyssal difference between what human eyes see in the act of forgiving and what God sees. Human eyes see capitulation. God sees control. Human eyes see vulnerability. God sees courage. Human eyes see someone who has left it cheap. God sees someone who has chosen to be free. Let's understand why. In the culture of the ancient Mediterranean, the cultural context where almost the entire Bible was written, honor was the most valuable currency in existence. Not money, not land, honor. When someone offended you, the response expected by society was retaliation. You would return the offense in some way, with words, with actions, with social exclusion, to restore your honor before everyone. Not retaliating was considered weakness. It was considered an admission that you were inferior. And it is in this exact cultural context that Jesus says something completely subversive: love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. For listeners at that time, this was not only spiritually difficult, he was socially suicidal. It was the reversal of everything that culture taught about how to survive in a cruel world. And it is precisely there that the point that God sees and that others do not see. Psychologists who study human behavior have identified a phenomenon called emotional reactivity. Basically, it's the tendency we all have to automatically react to stimulus, especially when the stimulus is a threat or an offense. When someone hurts you, your limbic system fires before the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, has time to process. Anger, the impulse to defend oneself, the urge to fight back. All of this is automatic. To forgive goes against this automatism. It is not repression. It's not pretending you didn't feel it. It's a conscious choice, one that requires activating the very part of the brain that most people don't access in times of pain: executive control. The ability to say, I feel it and yet I'm going to choose differently. From a neurological point of view, forgiving is one of the most complex and advanced acts that a human being can perform. God created this system. God knows what's going on when you forgive. And when he looks at you at that moment, he doesn't see someone who didn't know how to defend himself. He sees someone who knew how to govern himself. And governing oneself, controlling one's impulses, consciously choosing over reacting, is one of the most consistent marks of spiritual maturity in the entire Bible. Think of David. He had Saul in his hands, twice. Two real opportunities, with the most rational logic in the world, supporting the decision to finish off that man who had tried to kill him again and again. David's own men said, "Today is the day which the Lord has promised you." It was the perfect cue. And David did nothing. Not out of cowardice, not for lack of strength, but because something inside David, what the Bible calls reverence for God, was greater than the impulse to take revenge. That's what God sees. The ability to hold on to what you are entitled to use for a reason that goes beyond the immediate situation. And there is another element that human eyes rarely grasp: the identity dimension of forgiveness. When you forgive someone, you're not just dealing with that person. You're sending a signal to your entire relationship system, including yourself, about the kind of person you are. You're saying, my identity doesn't depend on whether you got it wrong or right. My identity is something that is beyond this situation. That's exactly what God sees. He sees a person whose identity is anchored in something that the other's mistake cannot destroy. That is why Jesus does not only praise the act of forgiving, he commends the inner willingness to forgive, the readiness of the heart. 7 times 70 is not a literal number. It is an image of a heart that does not keep count, a heart that is not waiting for the opportunity to charge. This heart God recognizes, and what he sees there is not weakness disguised as goodness. It is strength disguised as kindness. The invisible price of forgiveness, what happens inside you before you let go. No one talks about the real cost of forgiveness. People talk about the outcome: peace, liberation, healing. They talk about how beautiful it is to forgive. They talk about testimonies of people who have forgiven and been well. But almost no one talks about what happens in between, the dark stretch between pain and peace, the real, visceral, often lonely process of letting go of something you had every right to hold. And it is exactly in this passage that God is most present. There is a concept in psychology called grief elaboration. Originally developed to understand the process of loss by death, it has been expanded to include all forms of significant loss, breakups, betrayals, deep disappointments. The classical model describes stages: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance, and while these stages are not linear in real life, they describe something true. The process of losing is not instantaneous. Neither is forgiving. And when you understand this, you stop judging yourself for not having truly forgiven yet, even after you have said the words. Let's look at a biblical character that few associate with the theme of forgiveness, but who lived this process in a devastatingly human way: Job. Job lost everything: children, health, goods, reputation. And the book's narrative is largely the honest record of a man in the process of deep grief. He doesn't hide his anger. He does not perform spirituality. He confronts God directly, questions the justice of what happened, weeps, laments, and at times seems to be on the verge of collapse. But God does not rebuke Job for this. On the contrary, at the end of the book, it is Job, not the friends who have been defending God with correct theological arguments, who receives the divine commendation. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job did. This is revolutionary. It means that God prefers the brutal honesty of genuine pain to spiritualized responses that hide the wound. And when Job finally prays for the friends who hurt him with cruel words during his suffering, that's forgiveness, not performative forgiveness. Forgiveness that passed through the fire. The invisible price of forgiveness has at least 3 layers that are worth understanding. The first layer is the recognition of injustice. To truly forgive, you must first name what happened. What that person did was wrong. It really hurt me. It wasn't my fault. Many people try to skip this step, especially in religious contexts where there's pressure to get over it. But this step is fundamental. You can't let go of what you've never held, and you can't hold on to what you've never named. The second layer is the choice not to use pain as currency. When someone hurts you in a serious way, you acquire a kind of emotional credit. You have reason to keep your distance, to tell the story over and over again, to reap the sympathy of the people around you. Using this credit isn't wrong in itself, but at some point, continuing to use it becomes a way of staying stuck in the past. Letting go of that credit, letting go of the role of victim when it has become comfortable, is one of the hardest parts of forgiveness. The third layer, and the deepest, is what therapists call memory desensitization. The memory of pain does not disappear when you forgive, but over time, with the actual process of elaboration, it loses its emotional charge. You can remember what happened without your heart racing, without anger waking up from the bottom. Memory exists, but it no longer rules. God sees this whole process. He doesn't just see the end result. He sees you in the middle of the night, still angry, still in fresh pain, choosing not to call that person to return the blow. He sees you in line at the grocery store, remembering what happened and feeling the tightness in his chest, but continuing to walk. He sees every micro-choice you make towards forgiveness, even before you've actually gotten there. And in each of these choices, he recognizes something of himself in you, because God himself knows the price of forgiveness. Not in a theoretical way, in a concrete, incarnate, historical way. Divine forgiveness has cost something real. And perhaps that's why he looks at the human process of forgiving with a depth of recognition that goes beyond what any other creature could have. What Joseph, David, and Jesus had in common, that you probably have too: 3 men. 3 completely different eras, 3 situations of pain that do not compare with each other in circumstances, but that carry an identical inner pattern. Jose, David, Jesus. Each one was betrayed by those closest to him. Each one had plenty of reasons not to forgive. and each, at the decisive moment, chose a path that defined not only who they were, but who they would become. The question that remains is, what was it about them that allowed this choice? Was it an exclusive supernatural gift? Was it personality? Was it creation? The answer that the Bible suggests, and that contemporary psychology corroborates, is more accessible than it seems. And when you understand what was in them, you have a good chance of recognizing the same in you. The first element in common is the ability to separate the action from the actor. Joseph said to the brothers, "It was not I who sent you hither, but God." This is not a denial of what happened. It is a reinterpretation that places evil within a larger context. Joseph did not minimize what the brothers did, but he did not collapse their identity in the act they committed. They were more than that betrayal. Psychologists call this cognitive diffusion, the ability not to fuse an event with a permanent identity. You did something wrong is different from you are essentially a wrong being. This distinction, seemingly subtle, is the psychological basis of genuine forgiveness. David demonstrated something similar with Saul. Even though he was persecuted, even though he knew that Saul wanted his death, David refused to reduce Saul to an enemy to be eliminated. He continued to see in Saul the anointed king, an identity that present errors did not completely erase. Jesus, on the cross, asked forgiveness for those who crucified him, saying, "Because they know not what they do." This phrase is not condescension. It is the maximum expression of the same capacity to see people's limitations and blindness without transforming this blindness into irreversible evil. The second common element is forward-looking. Jose was not trapped by the trauma. When he was reunited with his brothers, he did not use the power he had to collect the past. His attention was on what could still be restored, not on what had been destroyed. David, after Saul's death, did not celebrate. He cried, and he immediately wondered if there were any descendants of Saul to whom he could show kindness. Their energy was in the direction of building, not demolishing. Jesus, resurrected, did not appear to confront those who crucified him. He appeared to restore those he loved, including Peter, who had denied knowing him 3 times. The first conversation after the resurrection was not one of demand. It was a reconnection. This pattern of future guidance is not naive. It's an active choice to invest the available emotional energy in what can still grow, rather than feeding what has already died. The third element, and this is the one that will surprise you, is the willingness to be misunderstood. Joseph was seen as naive by his brothers when he hugged them. David was questioned by the men themselves when he spared Saul. Jesus was called weak and a failure by the crowd that days before had cheered him. The 3 were misunderstood at the exact moment they chose forgiveness, and the 3 did not reverse the choice because of this. This is extraordinarily rare. Most people abandon forgiveness when they realize that it will not be valued or understood. Why forgive if no one will see the greatness of it? But Joseph, David, and Jesus forgave in a kind of loneliness, knowing that God saw even if no one else did. And now the direct question. Do you recognize any of these elements in yourself? Have you ever managed, even with pain, to separate what someone has done from who that person is deep down? Have you ever chosen to look at what can still be built instead of cataloging what has been destroyed? Have you ever forgiven someone without receiving recognition for it, and did it anyway? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, you have more in common with these 3 men than you realize. And God, who recognized in these traits a resemblance to himself, recognizes the same in you. When forgiveness hurts. The difference between liberating and merely swallowing. There is a huge mess that needs to be cleared up now. To forgive is not to swallow. It's not pretending. It's not silencing the pain and calling it spirituality. And perhaps the biggest pitfall that exists on the subject of forgiveness, especially in Christian circles, is exactly this: confusing emotional suppression with genuine forgiveness. The difference between those who liberate and those who just swallow is not in words, it's in what's happening inside. Let's start with a piece of data from clinical psychology that is too important to ignore. Studies of what researchers call premature forgiveness, situations in which people were pressured to forgive before they were ready, or forgave only to avoid social conflict, show consistent results. This type of forgiveness does not produce the expected psychological benefits. On the contrary, it is associated with increased anxiety, a drop in self-esteem, and more dysfunctional relationship patterns over time. In other words, swallowing does not liberate. Swallowing clogs. The Bible does not encourage such confusion. On the contrary, she's surprisingly honest about the weight of pain. The Psalms are perhaps the most vivid example of this. Psalm 22 begins with a cry of abandonment. Psalm 55 describes someone who feels his heart twitch inside his chest because of a close friend who has betrayed him. Some psalms even express desires for revenge, and they are there in the sacred text without being censored. The fact that these texts exist in the prayer book of God's people is an unmistakable sign. God does not want pain suppressed. He wants honest pain. So what is the real difference between truly forgiving and simply swallowing? Whoever swallows denies it. He says, "I'm fine," when he's not. He smiles in front of the one who hurt him and cries alone. He repeats, "I have forgiven," as a mantra to convince himself. It acts as if the wound does not exist while it rots inside. Over time, this person becomes progressively more closed, more suspicious, more difficult to reach, without being able to understand why. Those who truly forgive recognize first. It says, "It hurt me." It allows anger to exist, crying to happen, grief to have its time. And then, from a place of awareness, not denial, you choose not to let that pain govern your future decisions. The difference is that one is an escape and the other is a crossing. And God knows the difference. He is not impressed by performative forgiveness. He does not collect beautiful testimonies to display in a spiritual showcase. He sees the inside. And when the interior is wounded but honest, when the person is in a real process, even if painful, God sees no fault. He sees courage. There is an episode in David's life that illustrates this perfectly, and that is almost never used in sermons about forgiveness. After his son Absalom tried to take the kingdom by force and died in battle, David weeps. He does not cry discreetly. He cries so intensely, so uncontrollably, so publicly that he embarrasses the entire army that had just risked their lives to defend him. Joab, his general, even rebukes him. "You have shamed all your servants today." Absalom's forgiveness of David was not cleansed. It wasn't pretty. It was chaotic, contradictory, full of pain that I didn't quite know where to put it. And God did not withdraw David's anointing because of this, because God understands that forgiving someone you love deeply and who still hurt you is one of the most complex processes that exist. There is no script. There is no deadline. There is no version that does not hurt. Real deliverance, what the Bible describes as the consequence of forgiveness, is not the absence of pain. It is pain that has lost the power to dictate its choices. You still feel it. But the wound no longer votes on his decisions. And at this point, you discover something that those who just swallow never discover. Truly forgiving does not weaken you. It rebuilds you. Piece by piece, choice by choice, it gives you back a wholeness that bitterness had stolen without you realizing it. What God deposits in the lives of those who choose to forgive, even without deserving an answer, we have reached the end. And that's perhaps the most important subtitle in the entire video. Because everything that has been said so far, the secret of the heart, the strength God sees, the invisible cost, the biblical examples, the difference between forgiving and swallowing. All of this sets the stage for a question that many people have but rarely verbalize. And after I forgive, what happens? What do I get out of it? It's a legitimate question, too human to be ignored. And the answer the Bible gives is surprising, not because it's magical, but because it's concrete, psychologically verifiable, and much deeper than "you'll feel better." The first deposit that God makes in the life of the one who forgives is clarity. This seems strange at first glance. What relationship has forgiveness with clarity? But think about it. While you carry active resentment against someone, part of your cognitive energy is constantly occupied with that person. You think about what you should have said. You rehearse conversations that you will never have. You revisit the event over and over again, sometimes without even realizing it. It's like having a program running in the background of your computer. It doesn't appear on the screen, but it's consuming processing all the time. When you truly forgive, this program closes. And suddenly, you have access to an ability to think clearly, to make decisions without the background noise of hurt, which you had forgotten existed. People who have gone through genuine processes of forgiveness describe a sense of open field, as if the fog has lifted and they can see further. This is not a spiritual metaphor. It's neurology. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning, planning, and decision-making, works best when the limbic system is not in a constant state of alert. Forgiving reduces this alertness, and God, who created this system, knew what he was doing when he connected forgiveness to abundant life. The second deposit is spiritual authority. This is the one that is least talked about, and perhaps the most impactful. In the Bible, there is a recurring pattern. The characters who have passed through the fire of forgiveness then receive a kind of influence that cannot be explained by talent or circumstance alone. Joseph forgave and became the most powerful man in Egypt after Pharaoh, not by accident, but because the same heart that had gone through the process of forgiveness was now prepared to carry a weight of responsibility that a bitter heart could never bear. David has repeatedly forgiven Saul, Absalom, others, and is described as the king after God's own heart, not the perfect king, not the king without flaws, the king whose heart was oriented in the right direction. Jesus forgave on the cross and 3 days later carried authority over death and life. Forgiveness, in the biblical universe, is closely linked to the ability to influence. Because a person who has genuinely forgiven carries with them an inner integrity that the people around them feel, even without being able to name it. There is something about this person that is not trying to prove anything, that is not operating from unresolved wounds, that can be truly present with others. That presence has power. The third deposit, and the most personal of all, is the expanded experience of God's grace. There is a phrase from Jesus that, if you stop to think about it, is disturbingly direct. He says, "Forgive, and you will be forgiven." Not as a transactional contract, but as a description of how the human heart functions in the presence of God. When you forgive, you are not just performing a moral act. You are exercising, from the inside out, something that is part of God's nature. And in doing so, you open up in yourself a capacity to receive that was previously closed. Not because God was withholding, but because the heart occupied with resentment has little room to notice what is already being poured out. It's like trying to fill a glass that's already filled with something else. When you let go, when you really let go, not performatively, but really, there is an inner opening that many people describe as meeting God in a way they have never experienced before. An approximation, an intimacy, a feeling of being completely seen and completely loved that does not depend on anything the other does or does not do. And perhaps this is exactly what God is depositing in your life when you forgive, without receiving a response, without receiving an apology, without receiving recognition. He's giving you back to yourself, whole, free, with clarity to walk, with authority to influence, with internal space to receive what he always wanted to give you. That's what God sees in you when you forgive easily. Not naivety, not weakness, not someone who doesn't know how to defend himself. He sees someone who has learned, or is learning, to carry within himself something that the world can rarely sustain for long. The ability to love without charging, to let go without losing, to give without having to receive in return. And that, in God's eyes, is one of the most precious things a human being can be.